Recently, President Trump called Minnesota Governor Tim Welz a retard. Well, in Russian it's called idiot, but I don't agree with that. He's a person who covered up theft, $8 billion, maybe even more, by the way, from his own state's budget. He's not an idiot. He might be playing dumb, widening his eyes, laughing meaninglessly, though at least he hasn't started blowing bubbles from his mouth yet. But this is the biggest fraud, the biggest budget scheme in the history of the United States of America. And that's why Tim Welz is a champion. He deserves to be recorded in the Guinness Book of Records. Are you an idiot?
Yes. Based on what we've discovered so far, we believe that the Somali fraud operation in Minnesota is the largest theft of taxpayer money through welfare fraud in American history. We believe that we've only scratched the surface of how deep this goes. And are you aware of all these schemes involving faking autism in children who aren't actually autistic? With pretending that people are being enrolled in food programs, when in reality, no one was ever actually enrolled? And with involvement in massive fraud, lying, stealing, and extortion on a scale we've never seen before in American history. The final amount in this case will significantly exceed the figures that have already been mentioned. We believe that the state government is fully involved in this scheme, and we believe that what we reveal will shock the American people.
Steve Miller believes that the figure of $8 billion is underestimated, that it is not final, and that the real final amount of budget damage is shocking. And he also believes so, well, not without reason. I think that the state leadership was not only aware, but also actively participated in the allocation of budget funds. And if that's the case, then the governor. He is the former Democratic Party vice presidential candidate Varyuga.
However, available data shows this is a significant underestimate. 75% of Somalis in Minnesota live on welfare, but this probably greatly underestimates the real financial burden imposed by the Somali population.
More than 3/4 of those who came from Somalia are refugees, and 80% of immigrants said they received government support for food, housing, healthcare, education, and a little money for entertainment.
Governor Walz, informants warned. Did you see the Attorney General's dismissive attitude? Congress? Wumen Amar is taking a defensive position, but apparently has connections with people, or at least people from her inner circle. M is apparently involved, though it's not proven yet. She's being very defensive. Do you believe this applies to all of them, their indifference, the amount of money, any possible protection they offered?
Yes, I think you'll see all of this, Sean. This scandal will shake the foundations of Minnesota politics and American politics. We will show how, whether it's due to deliberate ignorance, intentional turning away, or direct knowledge. Democratic politicians, democratic bureaucracies, democratic political systems, and the Somali refugee population deceived the American people, stole billions from taxpayers, and engaged in scams that boggle the mind, fraud so brazen we can hardly imagine it. This really highlights how the Democratic Party has weaponized migration against the American people to gain political power at the expense of American citizens. They steal their money, they steal their votes, they steal their sovereignty. This will be a clear example of the president's arguments. This is a tool that the Democratic Party used to completely rob the American people.
We just discussed how the deep state organized the persecution of Trump and all of us who didn't agree with their policies. And loudly, well, in my case, spoke out.
Sean, listen, this is standard. Anyone who enters the country legally must undergo a background check, have no radical ties, pass a health check, and not be a burden to the American people. And of course, you can't come here and rip off the American people.
That's a federal law, by the way, Sean. That's a federal law. That's been a federal law since the 1870s, which says that, first of all, you have to be financially self-sufficient. You can't receive welfare. And secondly, your sponsor has to sign a legally binding document promising that the foreigner they sponsor will not use welfare benefits. If they do, the sponsor will cover the full cost owed to taxpayers.
In other words, everything is already written into the law, but for 4 years, and I think even longer, the law hasn't been enforced. And as for the states, the feds simply don't have the right to check, well, that's the jurisdiction of each state. Here, a state is like a separate country. These kinds of groups of do-gooders, gangs, politicians, and officials are the ones robbing us of billions.
By the way, it's an exact copy of what Putin did. According to General Babkov, this is the 5th directorate, as it's called, the KGB, yes, in the city that used to be called Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. And now the major media have finally realized that Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, who, by the way, for some reason was chosen by Kamala Harris as vice president, is involved in ignoring a large-scale fraud scheme with benefits that was carried out in his state, mainly by Somali immigrants. The New York Times is now covering this story. They covered it in a devastating report which, according to the quote, says, "Fraud has overwhelmed Minnesota's social services system under Tim Walz's supervision." A sensational story. Here's an example of fraud. Feeding Our Future, a nonprofit, got government funds during COVID meant to buy food for hungry children. Instead, they were spent on luxury cars and even real estate projects abroad, right? Fraudsters took American taxpayers' dollars out of the country. Out of the 86 people charged with fraud, all but 8 were Somali. And this is where it gets worse. According to informants, government agents tacitly approved the fraud because Somalis had become an influential voting group in Minnesota, and the Democrats didn't want to lose their support. And Tim Walz himself admitted that these programs were overly generous during the pandemic. Well, he was very generous with your money. How nice of him, I quote. "The programs are designed to give money to people," said Tim Walz in an interview. "The programs aim to improve lives, but criminals often find loopholes." It's as if he's saying, yes, we were deceived. Well, we had good intentions. Note that the New York Times was not the first to report this. The conservative writer and activist Christopher Rufo got to it first. Because this is a legitimate story, the mainstream media had to cover it. However, not all liberal commentators appear to draw the same conclusions as the New York Times. That's right, we at The View shifted the topic from Tim Walz's failures to other failures. Well, you can probably guess who.
Here's what's interesting, because if you're upset because of the fraud, in 2018, a judge ruled that someone had to pay $25 million because of his fraudulent university. In February 2024, a New York judge found him, his sons, and his organization liable for fraud. Then 3 months later, he was found guilty on 34 counts of fraud.
That's true, Vuppy. We can't talk about anything except a Democrat's wrongdoing for more than 2 seconds before you start talking about Donald Trump. It's exactly this kind of careless disregard for the real problems that have arisen under Democrat leadership in blue states and cities that made the progressive media push middle America away and into the arms of Trump's Republican Party. If you think the Republican Party doesn't have the right solutions, justify it, but don't try to prove that it's democracy. Democrats like Tim Walz can be trusted to govern at any level.
You've heard how Democrats say Tim Walz is a thief, and Trump is also a thief. And Trump is even worse than Walz, so we're not going to talk about Walz, but about Trump.
Massive welfare fraud is the result. He allowed it to happen during his administration and is still making excuses for it. Progressive governance can't survive such massive failures, cutting the police budget, allowing unchecked welfare abuse, taxing the rich so aggressively that they just leave. This is the track record of left-wing progressives, and it's a path to disaster. You laughed along with,
well, here's what I thought. You know, it's so funny because it annoys you so much. When Vupi mentions Donald Trump at unnecessary moments, but Donald Trump mentions President Biden at always unnecessary moments, including every failure under his leadership.
And here's another defense Democrats use to change the subject. And again, Vupi did something bad, but Trump did something even worse. Personally, I always enjoy statements like, that guy is a bandit from that street over there. You have to protect your own good from him because he's even worse than me. Is this how things are in Ukraine? So their own bandits tell the people, Putin is even worse than us. I might cripple you, but he'll just destroy you. President Calvin Coolidge was probably the best president of the 20th century who built the most successful immigration policy in the history of the United States of America. By the way, the entry ban from 19 countries, turned into a list of 30 under Trump, and they say even 32 countries now, from which we don't get enough reliable information about those arriving. That's what our Democrats are yelling about and getting nervous over. This is a Fox commentator discussing it.
So what? Now investigators are tracking the fraud network to other Minnesota Democrats like Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Many of the suspects connected to the scheme live in her district, including a restaurant owner who hosted events for her. Since then, he has been convicted of stealing $12 million in COVID funds.
So what did Coolidge do?
So, just over a century ago, 101 years ago, President Calvin Coolidge signed the Immigration Act in 1924. Undoubtedly, the most successful immigration policy our country has ever had. Right after what we now call the Great Migration, this was a wave of immigration that swept through the early 1900s. When this massive influx of more than 14 million people arrived in this country, it was very similar to what we've seen over the past 5 years. A century ago, 14.5 million people came here, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe, quite different from today. At that time, it was mainly Italians, Poles, Jews fleeing from Europe and seeking opportunities in America. However, that period was so devastating for American citizens, for society as a whole, that Congress then passed the Immigration Act of 1924. Both Republicans and Democrats, both sides agreed that it was completely out of control. Something had to be done, and what they did was establish a new national origins quota system, which stated, we only want immigrants from certain countries, from certain places. People who contribute to America.
We want to bring people into our home whom we want, not those we don't want. They should be from certain countries, have certain professions, be healthy, have no criminal record, and so on. That's understandable.
America does not accept, it strictly limits immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and has completely banned all immigration from Asia. And they did this to preserve American society, our homogeneity, so that America would remain a predominantly white Christian country. Because back then, just like now, immigration got out of control. In fact, today it's much worse. The share of foreign-born people in the United States population today is much higher than at any other time in United States history. Every sixth person in this country today is a foreigner. That's even higher than the 1920s peak. The period we're talking about is when Calvin Coolidge signed the Johnson-Reed Act, that immigration law of 1924. That law remained the law of the land for almost 40 years. This greatly reduced new arrivals and provided an opportunity. This is a key moment for the large wave of arriving migrants. It gave them time to assimilate, and it worked. By the 40s and 50s, America was thriving again. The economy was booming. We had a real growing middle class, which we don't have today, and a sense of patriotism, which we definitely don't have today. Somehow, 100 years ago, our politicians understood the advantage of assimilation. But today, if you expect immigrants to assimilate and adopt American values, for some reason that's called being a Nazi rhetoric.
And now, under the banner of that kind of immigration that is destroying America, people who hate our country but live here. Ilhan Omar.
I want to ask about something else that Stephen Miller, the architect of immigration policy, said. On Thanksgiving, he wrote, "No miracles happen when people from troubled countries cross borders en masse. Migrants and their descendants reproduce the conditions and horrors of their ruined homelands." What do you think about this argument about the inability to assimilate and a kind of destruction of America as you understand it.
Ilkan Dimatorzak, Stephen Miller, 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 Miller, Stephen Miller, Stephen Miller. But if you have a pumpkin or a cabbage head instead of a head, it's impossible to understand anything.
When I think about Stephen Miller and his racist rhetoric, it reminds me of how the Nazis described Jews.
When there are no arguments, they bring up white supremacists and Nazis. It just means that, well, there's absolutely nothing to say. And she also mentioned Jews, but she herself and all the Somalis just adore Jews. They just can't stop kissing them.
You know, as we know, many immigrants tried to come to the United States, but they were sent back. For example, Jewish immigrants. We know how people who came from Ireland, Irish immigrants, were described. We know how people were described back then when they were Italian immigrants.
President Trump said over the weekend that it's time to go back to the Immigration Act of 1924. This is huge. It's a huge statement, a huge step in the right direction. This will be a complete overhaul. And right after Trump's post, the Department of Homeland Security, backing up his words, announced a suspension of immigration from more than 30 third world countries. They stated that these countries are too dysfunctional to properly vet and allow their citizens into the United States. Look.
Matt, we've heard that it's possible. It's expanding to 32 countries. Can you confirm? And which countries are being added to the list?
I won't give an exact number, but it's over 30. The president is still evaluating the countries. Listen, if they lack a stable government or a self-supporting country, tell us who these people are and help us vet them. Why should we let people from this country come to the United States?
One of the countries on this list is Somalia, along with others that you see on the map, plus 11 more countries already, more than 30 countries. Now, all of them, according to the Trump administration, are third world countries with failed governments. One of them, as we just said, is Somalia, a country that greatly benefited from the previous administration, which granted refugee status and legal status to many people now living in Minnesota, thousands of Somalis. Biden granted temporary protected status, and many of them were also given free plane tickets, free airfare just to come to our country. At least migrants from Latin America had to work hard to get here. They traveled thousands of miles to come here, leaving their whole lives behind. Look at the list of these countries. It's nothing like it was 100 years ago. 14 million people immigrated from Italy, Poland, and Russia 100 years ago. Now we import people from these same countries. How can that be a good idea? Obviously it's not, and we know this because one of these countries is Somalia. Right now, it is at the very center of this multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme that stole $8 billion of our tax dollars and sent them back to a terrorist group.
You and I have already talked about this, like how something bad can give rise to something good. The story with this massive theft allowed the Trump administration, using the sentiment of the people, to raise the issue of stopping immigration, not only from, let's say, underdeveloped countries of Latin America, but also from unfriendly and underdeveloped countries of the Middle East. These, for example, are thieves who envy us with deadly black hatred.
The House Republicans and the head of the Treasury have just spoken about a connection to terrorism, a possible connection. He said that they're only just starting to look into it now. How sure are you that this is a false claim?
I'm quite sure right now, because there are people who have been held accountable and sentenced. If there was any connection that the money they stole was used to finance terrorism, that would be a complete failure on the part of the FBI.
Somalis, by the way, who gathered in Minnesota as immigrants a century ago when a country is flooded with immigrants, they try to recreate what they left behind. It's just human nature. Italians did this 100 years ago. Italians stuck together in New York, so did the Poles, and also the Jews, forming their own communities in Chicago and New York. Now it's not Europeans, but immigrant communities from countries like Somalia, Haiti, Yemen, Sierra Leone, and Chad, third world countries, who are doing this. Investigative journalist Chris Rufo very accurately pointed out that the difference between now and then is that the leaders of these immigrant communities like Ilhan Omar are not like the leaders of the past. They defend and cover for these criminals, the criminals in their community who commit fraud. Look at what he said.
It's astonishing, it's shocking. And the traditional American story goes that immigrants came, they adopted American customs, they learned to speak English, they tried to assimilate into the culture. And if there were bad elements in their own culture, for example, if Italian Americans had the mafia, they were expected to reject and correct such crime.
So there were well-known Italian Americans, like Rudy Giuliani, who fought against the mafia. But in Minneapolis, we have exactly the opposite. Somali community leaders like Ilhan Omar defend the very people who scammed billions of dollars.
That's a very good point. Shouldn't Ilhan be furious about these scammers? They disgrace her people, her community. Instead, it seems like she's covering for them.
It really looks like she's protecting them. Well, in our terms, she's running a cover for them. Yes, because she, as well as the governor of this state, the mayor of Minneapolis, and the state attorney general, it really seems like they're in on it and just can't turn in this filthy scum because the scum would drag them down with it. And them too. Gentlemen, subscribe, like, and hit the bell, then you know what will happen. You'll get all the episodes of my videos on time. Goodbye until we meet again.